점수 잡는 hackers.
Hi, welcome back. Today we're going to go over the first practice test, Mark Bittman's Fixing Our Food Problem. We're going to write the essay together. We're going to first write the introduction. We're going to look at body number 1, 2, and 3. And then we're going to write the conclusion. And then at the end, we're going to do a quick review. And we're going to look at a few sentences, a couple of sentences and phrases that you can memorize. Let's go right into the introduction. In the article Fixing Our Food Problem, Mark Bittman builds an argument to persuade his audience that the American food production industry must undergo large changes. Make sure that you have the title, Fixing Our Food Problem, in quotation marks. Make sure that you have the author's full name, Mark Bittman. After that, you can write Bittman, his last name. Make sure that you have the main argument. American food production industry must undergo large changes. This was copied directly from the prompt, and you should paraphrase it. We'll do a little bit of paraphrasing later. Let's look at my next sentence. To persuade his audience, Bittman uses logical reasoning, authoritative evidence, and stylistic elements. You need to state your techniques, the 3 techniques. Make sure that you have it in order. In body number 1, I'm going to talk about logical reasoning. In body number 2, I'm going to talk about authoritative evidence. And in body number 3, I'm going to talk about stylistic elements. Keep it in order. Now, let's go back to this main argument here. I got this from the prompt. You want to do a little bit of paraphrasing. So instead of writing must undergo large changes and using changes as a noun, you can write the food industry can and must change. And I'm going to use change as a verb. Let's go into the outline for body number 1. Body number 1 is going to be on logical reasoning, and he uses 3 analogies. He uses these analogies to compare the food movement to another movement. So he uses the food movement and talks about the abolition movement. He talks about the food movement and compares that to the movement for women's voting rights. And then he uses a third analogy talking about the food movement and comparing it to the gay rights movement. And we're going to have 3 direct and indirect quotations on each of these movements. So let's look at paragraph 7. Now I just copied it directly from the passage, and from this paragraph I came up with my sentence. So let's actually look at my sentence. He uses analogies to convince his readers that although the food movement toward better and more sustainable food practices is still in its early stages. I wanted to directly quote food movement because I really want to focus on this movement. This is the main point of the whole argument. So I quoted food movement and I paraphrased just beginning to take shape to it's still in its early stages. So changing the word beginning to it's still in its beginning stages, it's still in its early stages. Large steps forward can and will be made. Now this was just one point that I just added. In this paragraph, he's talking about how the food movement is still in its early stages. But later on, he's going to talk about how large steps need to be made. Let's move on to paragraph 7. And we're going to look at the bottom part of paragraph 7 here. And let's look at how I got my sentence. He draws a parallel between the ethical food movement and the abolition movement. So he talks about the food movement, and he compares that to the abolition movement. And you don't need to quote this because I'm going to quote later on. So I just wrote, draws a parallel between A and B. So he's using the analogy to draw a parallel between A and B. You can memorize this expression. You can also use the expression, he makes a comparison between A and B, which marked the beginning of advocacy for equal rights for African Americans. So the abolition movement basically wanted to have equal rights for African Americans. That didn't happen right away. He notes that this movement began 200 years before the civil rights movement, when true legal equality for African Americans is generally considered to have begun. And I paraphrase this. In this last sentence right here, in paragraph 7, it stated, the abolition movement began at least a century before the Civil War, 200 years before the Civil Rights Movement. And I wrote 200 years before the Civil Rights Movement. So basically, the author is trying to tell you, Bittman is trying to tell you here that the abolition movement and the Civil Rights Movement, there were 200 years between these movements. So it took 200 years to actually show progress, and it took 200 years for African Americans to gain their rights. He's inferring that, similarly, the ethical food movement, it just began, and it might even take 200 years for it to show progress. Paragraph 7 continued. He talks about two more struggles, or two more movements. The first one, the struggle to gain the right to vote for women, and then the second movement, the gay rights struggle. And I'm going to talk about those two in my sentence. Let's look at my sentence. He supports his statement with two more analogies as evidence. The movement for women's voting rights. I didn't quote this because I paraphrased it. And it took 75 years to show results. I paraphrased it. It was active for 75 years before an amendment was passed. So basically, showing results is referring to that the amendment was passed. So it took 75 years for the American women's voting rights to occur. He's also inferring similarly, the food movement might even take 75 years. He again talks about the gay rights struggle, the gay rights movement. I paraphrased it, so I didn't directly quote it. It's still in progress, or it's still in the process of achieving its goals. How do we know that it's still in the process of achieving its goals? If you look on this last sentence here, but equal treatment under the law is hardly established. He's saying that equal treatment is not established yet, it didn't occur yet, which means that it's still in the process, despite existing for at least 40 years. And it made tremendous strides over 40 years. So it improved over 40 years, but it's still occurring. Basically, he's inferring that the food movement just started, and it might take more than 40 years for us to see progress and for us to see the results. Let's look at paragraph 8. He's focusing on these activists in these movements who sacrificed their lives. And I really just want to quote this word for word. So inside my sentence I wrote, Bittman writes that, and I quoted this, activists who took on these issues had in common a clear set of demands. I copied it word for word, so I have my quotation marks, and a willingness to sacrifice time, energy, and even life. I wanted to quote it word for word. Keep in mind that activists, it's not capitalized. Yes, it is capitalized in the passage, but it doesn't matter if it's capitalized or not in the passage. It matters about your sentence. In my sentence, I wrote, Bittman writes that activists, and it's a continuation of my sentence. So the activist is not capitalized. For the benefit of others, for the benefit of others. I kind of paraphrased the end part, so I just ended my quote here. So keep in mind that you can quote phrases and make that into one sentence. Then let's look at my full body number 1. From the outset, from the beginning, from the start, Bittman uses logical reasoning to appeal to his audience. You need to have the last name, and then after, you can use pronouns like he. Do not start, he uses logical reasoning. You should avoid having pronouns in your topic sentence. Talk about the rhetorical device that he uses. Logical reasoning, be a little bit more specific, and talk about analogies. He uses analogies to convince his readers that although the food movement toward better and more sustainable food practices is still in its early stages, large steps forward can and will be made. I had a direct quotation because I really wanted to focus on the food movement. For example, he draws a parallel between the ethical food movement, and the abolition movement. As I said before, the author will use analogies to draw a parallel, to make a comparison between A, the food movement, and B, the abolition movement, which marked the beginning of advocacy for equal rights for African Americans. He notes that this movement began 200 years before the Civil Rights Movement, when true legal equality for African Americans is generally considered to have begun. So this first half of my body number 1, I paraphrased everything, so I just used indirect quotations. Let's move on to the second half of body paragraph 1. He supports his statement with 2 more analogies. Since we already talked about an analogy in the first half, I wrote 2 more analogies, 2 additional analogies as evidence. The movement for women's voting rights took 75 years to show results, and the gay rights movement is still in the process of achieving its goals, despite existing for at least 40 years. So talking about these 2 movements, we're going to move on to a direct quotation. Bittman writes that activists who took on these issues had in common a clear set of demands and a willingness to sacrifice time, energy, and even life for the benefit of others. And I used direct quotations to really focus on the sacrifice that the activists made for the benefit of others, on the behalf of others. Bittman, now since I wrote he a few times, you can use the last name. Bittman effectively connects these analogies. There were 3 analogies, right? The abolition movement, the women's rights movement, and then the gay rights movement. So you could have included these 3 analogies to his main point, effectively convincing his audience that although the movement has just begun, this does not mean it cannot bring about large changes in the future. Now, he didn't really state this yet, but he's going to state it later on in the passage. Now, he talks about these 3 movements, and he talks about how the food movement is in the beginning stages, and you can see bigger changes later on. Will bring about large changes. Another word for large. You can use words like significant changes or substantial changes.